We're going to talk about different basics of vegetable garden. We'll discuss methods, location, planning, watering, etc. So first, we have methods. You can grow vegetables in the ground. If you have great soil, this might be the option you like. I personally have done most of my gardening either in the ground or in containers. But many people like raised beds, especially if they don't have good soil or if they have issues where they can't lean down and dig. This is a better option for them. It's very popular right now, and there are different things available to help you build raised beds, such as kits that have corner pieces and things along those lines. If you have questions about those things, we certainly can answer them. Whoops, sorry about that. Come on. Containers. The picture on the right of the tomatoes, I have never got my tomatoes to be that plentiful, but it's something to aspire to. Anna does a lot of raising of her eggplants in containers and very successful at it. We've actually done a presentation in a newspaper article on container gardening and vegetables that we'd be glad to share if anybody would like to see that. Okay, as the real estate people say, location, location, location. Most vegetables need full sun, which is 6 to 8 hours. You have to watch obstacles. You don't want to dig around utilities. You don't want to get them too close to big shrubs and trees that will have a lot of roots that will compete with your vegetables for water and nutrients. So the best thing to do is look for an area that's not very close to those kind of obstacles. I've always liked to do close to the house. If you're going to have herbs and vegetables, it's nice to have them close to the house, especially if you forget to bring your tomatoes in when you're cooking and you just need to run out to the garden to get them. Soil should be loose, well drained, and fertile. And we will talk about soil a little bit later. And water, it's always more convenient to have some kind of water system near the garden site. Size of the garden. As you can see, we've laid out some things you can consider. Sometimes it has to do with the physical. Sometimes it has to do with time. And you really should try to really evaluate how much time you want to spend on a vegetable garden. The one at the top right is a full-time job, I think. The one at the bottom left, which is just around the corner of the house, is much more reasonable if you don't have a lot of time to dedicate to them. Because you can remember that you will get a lot of tomatoes off certain tomato plants. Something we have that's very helpful is we have this garden plan. And it helps you as to when to plant and when you should expect to plant a second time because you've harvested. We have a very long growing season here. We were talking before the presentation started that we're already talking and planting things like potatoes and onions. So it's nice to lay out a plan of what you're planning to plant and some dates for it. This is a nice example of something that you could use to plan out your garden and when you should be planting and not planting. You can adapt this to any size. So don't be intimidated by the fact that we have all these things. You can plant this, make it work for the size that you want to do. This is another version of a plan. This has to do more with when you can harvest, when you should plant and when you should harvest. There are a lot of strategies that when you start growing, that you will, as you can harvest them, that you would start another crop right behind it. You could also try to intersperse, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, of things that are going to be done first and start in amongst those plants, new plants that'll be coming to maturity after the first set of plants dies off.
I want to say that this garden calendar is for our area, so it is very useful.
Yes, it is for our area.
Yeah. Yeah. So once you have planned your garden, you know where the location of your garden is going to be and the size of your garden, you have to think about the soil. And Linda mentioned that the soil should be porous, and that is because for a productive, productive garden, the structure and the texture of the soil should be loose and porous, and that's to allow air to penetrate the root system, and also for water to drain out of the soil. So many times, if you're in an area where the soil is not very good, and it's in, for example, new developments where the topsoil has been removed, it is very important. You'll be doing a lot of amendments to the soil to get to this point of having good soil structure and texture. And sometimes rototillers are used in soil preparation just to reduce the physical effort of turning the soil. But you have to be careful when using rototillers, because sometimes tilling the soil can ruin good soil, the structure of the soil, and that is because it tends to get compacted. So to avoid those types of problems, till only when there's a specific task, such as preparing a new bed or a new site. And in gardens that have good structure and good soil, there's no need to till. And also turning the soil over completely on a regular basis year after year is also not recommended, because what happens is that it might upset the microorganism ecosystem. And again, if you have soil like the one that you see in this picture, it's dark brown, it seems loose, you do not need to till or mix the soil on a regular basis. Now, garden beds and raised beds do not need to be tilled, as I said, and the way to get to this type of loose soil and porous soil is by adding organic matter, humus, composted manures, and leaf humus, and cover crops. So the first thing that that you need to do, or that is recommended when you're preparing your new site or new garden, is to do a soil test. And this is because the results of a soil test will tell you what the pH of the soil is and provide you with some guidelines of what amendments are needed, such as lime or fertilizer, whether the soil is lacking organic matter. And so that's why it is recommended that you do a soil test about every 3 years. So that it's important to do that when you prepare the soil. When you start a new bed, or when you haven't done a soil test in some years. These results will also tell you the percentage of organic matter in the soil. So if your soil has about 5 to 6% of organic matter, that's a very good indication that you have good soil. In new developments and new beds, sometimes the amount of organic matter is less than 1%. So you know that you'll be adding a lot of amendments. And also the pH, knowing the pH is very, very important, because the pH regulates the availability of nutrients. Sometimes your soil can have sufficient supply of nutrients, but they're unavailable to the plants, and that is because the plants can't uptake certain nutrients if the pH is very low or the pH is very high. So that's why you need to know what the pH of your soil is. In general, veggies prefer pHs that range between 6 and 7. Now, the amount of nutrients in the soil will obviously determine how well your plants grow. And the 3 main nutrients needed for plant growth is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Of these 3 nutrients, nitrogen is the one that has to be added every year, and that's because it leaches out of the soil. The other 2 do not leach, so you don't have to add them unless a soil test says that you are low in phosphorus or potassium. The plants also need micronutrients, or nutrients that are needed only in very small amounts, like manganese and sodium, calcium, and a lot of other ones. And those are available through organic fertilizers, such as blood meal, bone meal, and composted manures. So that's why it's also important to add, organic fertilizers. If using synthetic fertilizers, and the soil, always do it according to the results of the soil test. But if you don't have soil tests available, if you don't have the results of a soil test, then it is recommended to use a balanced inorganic fertilizer, like 10-10-10. And these formulations, 10-10-10, mean that in a bag of fertilizer, 10% of that is nitrogen, 10% is phosphorus, and 10% is potassium. So, for example, if you're growing leafy greens, lettuce, and those types of plants, then a balanced fertilizer like this is what's recommended. If you're growing fruiting plants like tomatoes and peppers, then 5-10-10 is what's recommended. So there's less nitrogen, more phosphorus, and more potassium, because you don't want an excess of nitrogen, because the plants will then put out a lot of leaves, but not as much fruit. But again, the advantage of using organic fertilizers is that besides adding organic matter to your soil, it provides the plants with micronutrients that are not available in synthetic fertilizers. But always try to add the fertilizers according to the results of a test. Now, the methods of adding fertilizers can be, and again, the results of a test will tell you whether you have to side dress with a fertilizer that has nitrogen, just nitrogen, or because nitrogen is always the limiting nutrient, or if you are low in potassium, for example, it'll tell you what you have to add to the soil. So that's it. Nitrogen usually is added like at the beginning of the season before you start planting, and so you add it to the soil and turn the soil. Side dressing is you do it later in the season, you add the fertilizer around the plants, and in the case of fruiting plants like cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers, you add it once the plant has set fruit. You do have to be careful when using synthetic fertilizers, because you can burn the plants if added in excess. If you're adding compost or manures, usually the recommendation is to add 2 to 4 inches per year of composted material or composted manures. But again, it all depends on how healthy your soil is. In terms of watering, the rule of thumb is that plants require about 1 inch of water per week for normal growth. And if you're not sure if your soil is sometimes the soil might look dry at the surface, but if you have watered well, just dig a small hole near the plant and see how much moisture you have in the soil. It is always better to water your plants in the morning, first of all, because plants need moisture for photosynthesis, and also because it's the leaves of the plants should be dry at the end of the day to avoid the spread of diseases, or to discourage diseases like fungi and bacterial infections. If during the heat of summer, sometimes you have to add supplemental water. If you have to do that, always soak thoroughly the soil, because otherwise, if you just add water to the surface, what happens is that the roots of the plants will start rooting at the surface instead of having a strong rooting system. In tomatoes, for example, that you want to plant them deep, and in order to encourage a very strong rooting system, if you water at the surface level, you'll start seeing all these little roots coming out of the surface, so which is not very good. Okay, and as I said, soak the soil, and maybe 5 to 6 inches deep, and that will that amount of water will get to the root system rather than just the surface. And it is recommended to apply the water about ½ inch per hour just to prevent runoff. And there are different irrigation systems, soaker hoses, sprinklers, but the best way of watering is just water at the root system. So soaker hoses is a good option. So regardless of whether you are new to gardening or not, planning is important for the success of your garden. So you want to think what to plant, how much you want to plant, and obviously that will depend on the likes and dislikes of your family, but it is recommended to plant varieties that are disease resistant or varieties that have that do well in our area. There are some varieties that are called All-American, and those are varieties that have been tested in trials across the country and do well in different climates. So that's a very good option to when deciding what varieties to plant. They perform better, and you get better results. So it's always a smart choice. If you want to limit the amount of pesticides, it's always good to go with those types of varieties. Here are some examples of tomatoes, disease-resistant varieties of tomatoes, and there are many more. But this is just a few of the common varieties that a lot of us grow and that you see in the nurseries. Celebrity is one variety that does very well, and I plant celebrity in pots, and I'll show you some photos later on. Juliet is cherry tomato. It's more like a grape tomato. And on the right-hand side, you see that some of these are resistant to a variety of diseases like verticillium, fusarium, that are some are bacterial diseases or fungi, to nematodes. Some of these varieties are resistant to nematode infections and different types of viruses. So again, this is just a small sample of some of the common varieties, and they do well in our area and are have resistant to different diseases. And these are examples of disease-resistant varieties of cucumbers. This is just a very small sample. If you go to the Cornell University webpage, they have fact sheets of big. There's a big list of cucumbers that are resistant to viruses and bacterial diseases. And I just wanted to show you some examples of cool weather vegetables, and I'm sure that many of you already started putting seeds and in the ground for cool weather vegetables like peas and snow peas. Collard greens can be planted now also, and kale. Lettuce can be planted pretty soon, and onions. So these are just a few examples, and there are and then we have here heat-loving vegetables. And what I want to say about, we know that tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers like hot weather, and but we get anxious about planting our tomatoes in April, and our peppers. But mostly tomatoes is what I see a lot in the gardens in April, and that's because we go to a nursery and start seeing the little plants, and we say, well, it's a warm day today, it's spring, so we put them in the ground, and many times by the end of April we have a frost and the plants are gone. And there's no advantage, I say it many times, many people, there is no advantage to planting tomatoes in April. If you plant them in May when the soil is warmer and there's no danger of frost, they'll catch up. And in April, the plants will be stressed out and might, there's a possibility of that you might kill the plants if there's frost. The photo that I have here on the right-hand side is tomato that is, well, as you can see, kind of deformed, and that's what's called cat facing. And apparently, scientists believe that cat facing is caused by exposing the flowering tomato plants to much colder weather, like when it's in the 50s, and so the flowers are damaged and they result in tomatoes that are kind of deformed. I mean, you still can eat them and they might taste good, but they don't look very attractive. And I'm sure you won't see very many of these in the supermarkets. Sometimes irregular watering can cause some of these types of deformed crops, and some varieties are more prone to cat facing, for example. Can you show me the next slide, Linda? I have some other examples there of cat facing. So these are tomatoes that I grow in pots on my deck. And you can see on the right-hand side, a lot of my tomatoes were very delicious. It's a variety new variety that I am growing. This is my, I think, second or third year that I'm growing these tomatoes. But I think because I have them in pots later in the season when it's so hot, and well, it just, they get all deformed, but they're still pretty good. So that's one of the, there are other types of I think it's called fine lining, which is a certain type of, it looks like cat face, but not as severe. These are some of the other varieties that I grow in pots on my deck. On the left-hand side, I have this variety of eggplant. It's called Dancer. And they do really well for me in pots. It's a small type of, relatively small eggplant, but I always have a lot of luck with these, and I have been growing them for some years now. And then on the right-hand side, I have banana peppers, sweet banana peppers, which also, I mean, a lot of these pepper varieties do very well in pots. and my garden is getting shaded, and that's why I have started planting a lot of these in big pots. Next one, these are other examples of veggies that I grow in pots. Long beans or yard long beans, and I was introduced to these long beans by a Chinese friend of mine, and I also grow these cucumbers. Next one. And these beans are very, very productive, and with, I never have very many problems growing them. Aphids attack them once in a while. And then she also, my friend, introduced me to these long cucumbers, Japanese cucumbers. And again, the plants are very, very productive. The cucumbers are really tasty. And I just wanted to show you some of these different varieties, because it's always a lot of fun to, even if you're new to gardening, it's always a lot of fun to experiment with different, with new varieties or different varieties. So one year I saw some plants in a nursery for Armenian cucumbers, and I didn't know what they were, and I didn't, I had never tried them, so I planted them, and they did really well that first year. I had them in a raised bed. They did very well. It turns out that these Armenian cucumbers are more like summer squashes. And but then I grew them again the following year, but they didn't do very well. So I decided that now I have to try something new. But it's always fun to do that. Okay, so I think that's it for types of plants, and I think you're next.
Yes, succession planting. That's I mentioned that briefly earlier on. This is where you would, as you harvest the crop, you plant new. And so if you put in peas, when they finish, you would put in either a different kind of pea or maybe beans behind them, so that you continually use the soil. But you would need to do what Anna was talking about and watch your fertility, because you're growing things in a very small space, a lot of different things, and they'll use the nutrients. Intercropping is interesting. This is where, if you had a small plot and you were raising like leafy greens early in the season that will die out in our heat, you would maybe intersperse them with something like a tomato plants, so that by the time the lettuces are finished, the tomato plants would be getting larger and could take over that space. So they're interesting strategies for getting more out of your garden. Another thing to help gardening is companion planting. There are a lot of books and a lot of old wives' tale about companion planting. I've heard that marigolds just to do about everything. Now they do have some do resist bugs because of the smell, things like that. They're good for fighting off nematodes if you have them in your soil. But I read one time that they resisted rabbits. Well, I had baby rabbits in the middle of my garden with marigolds all around them. So you have to watch the source when you're looking up something like companion planting, and go with something a university says, rather than anybody who has a silly idea. My favorite companion planting really is planting herbs with my plants. They have a strong scent, and that usually helps to deter insects. but they also, if you let them bolt, they will have wonderful flowers that bees love. So my strategy is to clip some of them back so they don't bolt, but let some of them bolt so that they bring more bees in, especially for the bees I need for things like squash and any kind of melons, where I don't seem to have enough of those things out in the garden. Another item for maximizing your space is using staking or trellising. The one picture with the little teepee-like thing, I've done that a number of times. It's real simple, and I can get things up off the ground. And I like that with some kind of, particularly with small cucumbers, where they seem to do better if I have them off the ground. The staking here on the picture on the right, I haven't really done that. I'm assuming it's somewhat like my teepee thing, but it looks like you really would have to lash the plant to the stake to maybe keep everything up.
They look like determinate tomato plants.
Tomatoes. Yes.
And so, yeah, so it's a stake, and then you tie the plants to the stake as they grow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, both of these systems are made with inexpensive materials, especially the little teepees. If you have a source for bamboo, that's wonderful. They a medium to use. I'm going to show you now. This picture of the staking and trellising is a lot more elaborate, where they have a metal skeleton to the thing, and then things are tied to off the metal staking. Much more expensive than my little bamboo teepees. Another type of gardening is square foot gardening. There was a book written years ago on square foot gardening, and it became quite the rage. The philosophy is one, you would have your bed sectioned off in squares, and they have a formula for how many plants you would plant in each square. Like if you have a tomato plant, it'd be one in a square. If you were doing lettuces, there would be, leafy greens, there would be several, and it's been quite popular. And we've tried that in our demonstration garden, and it is productive. So it's an interesting way, and an interesting philosophy to try. And like I said, the book is called Square Foot Gardening. It's was by a man named Mel Bartholomew, and quite an interesting concept, and have a nice blueprint to try a different version of gardening. Oh, Anna, I think you're on again.
Okay, yeah, I think this is the last factor to take into account to ensure a successful garden, and that is to keep your pests under control. So it is a good idea to know what your good and bad insects are. Now I'm gonna give you some examples, and the best ways to keep your pests under control, and options for what to do, especially in small gardens. I think handpicking the bugs is probably the best way if you don't want to use pesticides. And there are traps and lures that you can use, but traps like those sticky yellow traps I used to use them, and they're effective for small insects and all, but the problem is that they also attract good insects and kill good insects. So I stopped using those, and I do all my bug control by hand picking whenever I see not only adult insects, but if I see the larvae and if I see the eggs, then I try to be on the lookout for any signs of insects, and especially at the beginning of the season, it's easier to do that because you start seeing eggs on your the cold-loving, and kale and collards, and so if you are on the lookout from the beginning, you can control them. Now, if you are using pesticides, just remember that you are working with food crops, so make sure that you read and follow the label instructions carefully. So examples of good bugs include pollinators and predators and parasitoids. And here are a few examples. On the left-hand side, it's a ladybug eating aphids. And in the middle is the larval stage of that black with some spots. It's a larval stage of ladybugs. And then on the upper right-hand side, you can see the eggs of a parasitic wasp that attacks the tomato hornworm. And what happens is that they lay their eggs on the worm, and the larvae, once the eggs hatch, the larvae feed on the worm and kills the worm. So it is important to make sure that you know that the parasitic wasp is a good bug, and the eggs are good for controlling certain pests. And the next slide shows another example of some other insects that attacks. So on the left-hand side is just the hornworm on a tomato, and on the right-hand side, squash bugs. And again, these are some of the common insects that you see. Well, these are the bad bugs, obviously, and but these are common in home gardens. Other bad bugs include, the next slide shows the squash vine borer, which causes a lot of problems in zucchinis and summer squash. I think it also affects some cucumbers, but it's mostly summer squash. There are some varieties of summer squash that seem to be a little more resistant to vine borers, but it's hard. They're hard to control. So on the left-hand side, you can see these little tiny eggs, and the moth, this red and black moth, deposits the eggs on the leaves, on the upper side of the leaves, and then you can see the damage of the larval stage of the vine borer. By then, I guess it's too late. So again, if you are on the lookout for, just check the leaves for the presence of eggs, and also the moth. If you see the moths yeah, and again, yes, if you remove the eggs from, just cut that piece of the leaf and remove the eggs, it's a good way of controlling the the pests or the vine borer. And if you see the first signs of the larval stages on the stems, you can also remove, if you kill the larva just by, making just a little slit on the stem and removing the larval stage, the plants will recover if it's at the initial stages of infestation. Okay, I think there's in contrast to insects and those types of pests, diseases caused by microorganisms like fungus and bacteria and viruses are more difficult to identify than identifying an insect. And in common gardening diseases include like blights, early blight, mildew, and mosaic viruses. And I'll show you some pictures of those. But one approach to pest control is the use of integrated pest management. And this approach relies primarily on non-chemical means to prevent and manage pest infestations. And chemicals are used as a last resort when there's a crisis and things get out of control, but otherwise there are the use of pesticides is discouraged, especially if you're growing vegetables. So examples of some diseases that are common in the garden are, the next slide shows on the left-hand side is tomato wilt, and you can see that plant that is almost dead, and this is caused by a fungus, and I think it's a soil-borne fungus. On the right hand side is early blight on tomatoes, and what you start seeing are the lower leaves become, when they become infested, they're kind of brown, and there's discoloration. The next slide shows different types of mildew, downy mildew on the left-hand side, and here you see like yellow spots on top of the leaf with like a dark mole at the bottom, and then on the right-hand side, powdery mildew, and that's very, very common. You can see like whitish, a white moldy growth on the leaves, and these, these diseases affect tomatoes and eggplants and cucumbers. And again, sometimes, like I said, these are difficult to identify, but if you think that you can't identify these diseases, then bring samples to the extension office of the University of Delaware, and they will, have their plant pathologists look at the samples and determine what problems you have.
Just one note. We knew powdery was spelled wrong on the picture, but we couldn't change it. So that was our little blue hour, was to kind of say, hey, we knew it was wrong, but we couldn't change it, and we wanted to use this picture. Okay, another beautiful picture, Anna.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. So this is anthracnose in tomatoes, and what you see are these sunken dark spots. The anthracnose also affects eggplants and cucumbers, and you can see those that bean that is also affected. So in tomatoes, you start seeing it as the tomatoes start to when they ripen. So these are just a few examples of common diseases in the garden, and it is probably impossible to have a disease-free garden, but there are ways of reducing crop diseases, and that's just by following certain a few cultivation practices. I always say that one of the things you have to be on the lookout for diseases, for insects, and I think that's one of the best ways of trying to control them and to keep things at bay. When I see in my plants, when I see brown leaves or signs of powdery mildew or yellowing leaves, I always go and I trim and remove all those leaves that are at the bottom of the plant near the soil. If they're touching the soil, I try to remove all that just to prevent the spread of diseases. But again, if you follow certain practices, cultural practices, it's a good idea. Like we mentioned, disease-resistant varieties. If you are starting your starting seeds, make sure that you use sterile seed starting media, and space your plants at the recommended distances, and that's just to make sure that air flows between the plants, that there's enough airflow, and also to prevent the spread of diseases. Watering practices that keep moisture off the foliage as much as possible is also a good practice to follow. Next one. Some other preventive practices. Again, make sure that you have good structure, soil structure and nutrient levels to keep your plants happy, and it is not recommended to walk through the garden after it rains or when the foliage is wet, just to avoid the spreading of diseases. Keep your weeds and debris out of the garden. One other thing that we always mention is to practice crop rotation, especially because there are certain types of diseases that are in the soil, and so that's always a good practice. Remove and destroy any diseased leaves or plants, and do it early on in the season. Early blight in tomatoes, I mean, sometimes you see it in, I don't know, June or late June or so. I start checking my plants from the very beginning, just to keep things under control. And finally, I think conclusions that gardening will be more rewarding with careful planning. Again, do a soil test if needed, and prepare your soil as recommended. Choose suitable varieties, and it's very important to figure out the planting dates for different types of plants that you're gonna grow. And we always talk about planning, and it's always good to put things on paper just to give you an idea of, you know, what you're gonna grow, and how much you're gonna grow, and all that. Design your bed, or you know, raised beds, or whatever method you're using for growing your plants. And then, most importantly, make time to enjoy the garden. Thank you. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, or
Larva of a lady beetle can eat up to 200 aphids a day. Oh, that's from Tracy. Egg removal can reduce the number of vine borers in the garden. Yeah, it's very important to look under the leaves for eggs.
yes.
Linda Pat asks, if soil has fungus, do you throw it away and put in new soil?
Well, a lot of the fungi are good fungi, from what I understand. There's some, you know, fungi that causes diseases, then I don't know how you determine that.
Well, sometimes you have like maybe a little fungus growing on the top of the soil layer. And I mean, if I have anything like that, I scrape it off a little bit and put it in the compost pile.
Yeah, there's certain diseases that can be soil borne, and that we would have to determine that by the plant. We would have to test the plant itself. We can't test the soil for the disease. So that's important to know, because sometimes people throw plants out and then we don't have the information we may need to send up to our pathologist. The other thing, crop rotation is really important. So you want to rotate every 3 years according to plant family. So, you know, squash, cucumbers, watermelons, cantaloupes are all in the Cucurbitaceae family. So if you're rotating what you plant, where you planted those plants last year, you should be going to a different plant family. And we have information about that, but you want to stay away from that plant family. So every 3 years, go back to that. And that helps with disease reduction as well.